Hi, my name is Brad Curl with the National Decency Forum. In 1986, we gathered some of the nation's leading experts on the issue of pornography at a forum here on Capitol Hill. In a few minutes, we'll hear from the Senate chaplain regarding the issue of pornography, and we'll also have a little 2-minute documentary overview before we introduce the panelists. I guess the reason we have a $9 billion pornography industry reaching our neighborhoods through dial-up porn, cable porn, satellite porn, through 80,000 video rental outlets is because we have an insatiable appetite for intimacy. And if we don't experience intimacy in a constructive, natural, healthy way, then we'll seek intimacy in perverted or bizarre ways. We'll go after the secret parts of other people's lives through pornography or through gossip magazines. What's Burt Reynolds really like on a date? What are the American Airlines stewardesses really like unrobed? Or we'll seek exciting one-night stands. Well, I guess until we experience the kind of dignifying intimacy with God and with one another that we're intended to have, we'll be in pursuit of things like pornography. And these industries will grow, and they need to be addressed. So please stay with us now while we break away to a 2-minute documentary, and then we'll hear from the Senate chaplain, and then we'll introduce the panelists. In the past 20 years, we have seen an astounding growth of the pornography industry. In this year alone, over 200 million pornographic magazines will be sold into our neighborhoods. Almost all of the 20,000 X-rated bookstores in our land sell a great deal of illegal material. They only get away with it because there is a lack of vigorous prosecution. There are 250,000 coin-operated viewing booths in the backs of so-called adult bookstores, which take in 8 billion quarters annually. These booths are notorious places for homosexual contact and are a breeding ground for AIDS. Coin-operated vending machines in our major cities offer crude pornography to any minor with 4 quarters. In 1986, over 150 million X-rated videotapes will be rented and sold into our neighborhoods. 25,000 mom-and-pop video stores have opened up in the past few years, and most of them are offering X-rated tapes. There are over 100,000 mailing of obscenity violations through the U.S. Postal Service every day. The U.S. Postal Service has had only 2 convictions in recent years for mailing adult obscenity. And in fact, the United States Postal Service is probably the biggest distributor of most forms of obscenity. Most feature films made in Hollywood since 1967 have been R-rated, featuring lots of nudity, promiscuity, and 4-letter words. Popular rock music groups celebrate everything from drugs to incest. It was in 1953 when Playboy magazine began publishing in Chicago, and it was their clever packaging of pornography, with serious articles, major corporate advertising, and interviews with famous people that helped America develop a tolerance for pornography that led to a $9 billion pornography industry. We're on Capitol Hill talking with Dr. Richard Halverson, chaplain of the United States Senate. Dr. Halverson was the keynote speaker at the first National Decency Forum. Dr. Halverson, what are some of the reasons you think this is a critical issue?
Well, a fundamental reason, Brad, is that what people read, what they look at with their eyes, what they listen to with their ears, goes inside and becomes a part of the person. And one who feeds on pornography, one who feeds on material like that, is storing up inside himself things that are bound to influence his outward actions, his behavior, his whole life. And when you think of that happening to a whole culture, to a whole society, as I think of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men and women and boys and girls taking in this garbage, infecting their lives with what's going on the inside, and making them a kind of person or a kind of culture, a kind of society that is indigenous to what they're taking in all the time. So I see it affecting a whole culture, affecting a whole society, and producing a society that's the antithesis of what God wants and what we want and what really America ought to be.
Do you have any words of encouragement to people out there in the local scene?
Well, I urge them to do everything they can to resist this personally, and to, whenever they get an opportunity, to do what they can to oppose it.
The panel included Dr. Angelo D'Agostino, psychiatrist, neurosurgeon, psychoanalyst, Jesuit priest, and recent director of Jesuit famine relief in Africa. Dr. D'Agostino is past chairman of the American Psychiatric Association's Committee on Religion and Psychiatry. Next, we had Colby May, an experienced Washington, D.C. communications lawyer. Mr. May is a partner in the Washington law firm of May & Dunn. Brenda McKillop was a Playboy bunny in Hollywood in the 1970s and attended parties at the Hefner Mansion. Mrs. McKillop has been traveling and speaking on the issue of pornography and the Playboy mentality since 1979. Dr. Carl Turner, an obstetrician gynecologist from Chicago who has had vast experience treating the growing numbers of pregnant teenagers in our inner cities. Dr. Judith Reisman. She won her PhD from Case Western Reserve University and has had vast experience in communications and the impact of media on our society. Dr. Reisman won a $700,000 grant from the Justice Department to research the impact of our society's most popular pornographic magazines. Arthur Taylor, former president of CBS, which included all record, tape, and television production, Mr. Taylor led a courageous campaign in the 1970s to secure a family viewing hour on primetime television. Paul McGady, director of the National Obscenity Law Center, a division of morality and media in New York City. Mr. McGady is perhaps the nation's leading expert on obscenity law. Tony Bishop, all-pro defensive back from the Canadian Football League. Tony operates an outreach ministry to inner-city youth in San Francisco. Reverend Steve Hallman is executive director of Citizens Concern for Community Values in Cincinnati. He is an ordained Methodist minister and has traveled widely helping start new local groups. The first question the panel will discuss is pornography and the First Amendment. Is it a free speech issue? It seems like the pornographers and others have spent a lot of money trying to convince the American public that we don't have a right to control obscenity, pornography, and decency, whereas in fact we have a long-standing tradition upheld again and again by the Supreme Court of controlling obscenity and indecency. We haven't had much enthusiasm among our leaders to do much about it in recent years, but in fact we've always had laws against certain kinds of speech, such as slander, such as perjury, such as yelling fire in a crowded theater. Copyright laws, you just can't borrow other people's speech without infringing on copyright laws in certain cases. Fighting words, these are all exceptions to free speech, and historically in the United States and in England and other countries, we've always had exceptions to free speech under the obscenity and indecency laws. Of course, there are a lot of people making money on pornography, and they're anxious to convince us that we don't have a right to control pornography. Let's turn to the panel now and see what they have to say.
We didn't start to prohibit obscenity in 1957 when the Supreme Court said it is not free speech. We've had obscenity laws, federal obscenity laws, for instance, since 1842. Laws against mailing obscenity since 1850, 1860. And in England, of course, obscenity was punished. It was never considered freedom of speech or freedom of the press. So when we talk about the First Amendment, we can say that it does not protect obscenity because it's not free speech or freedom of the press.
I think sometimes, Paul, that it would be better, we could improve the Supreme Court test. I've heard some pornography defense attorneys say that it makes it easy sometimes for them to sway a jury.
The Supreme Court test is about the best we're going to achieve in this milieu. I don't believe it's the best test available. I think it could be more restrictive. But I think we must live with it, we can live with it, and we can win with it. I mean, just take a look at Atlanta. 84 hardcore porn outlets. They're down to 0 because of the application of the Miller test. So you can win with it.
What about the fact that the pornographers are talking so much about free speech as if they were disciples of Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson? Does anyone want to comment on that?
You must remember that the First Amendment talks about that speech which is protected speech. And it's important to remember that while you're dealing with pictures which the courts have defined as being a form of speech, it is not a form of protected speech. And therefore, when panderers to the contrary of the public moray begin to say we are entitled to the protections from our government and the agencies of government, that's where the argument falls apart, because you're not dealing with an area of protected speech. For example, in a movie theater, everybody knows and no one contests that you can't stand up and yell fire because it's clearly contrary to the health and safety and welfare of the people there and the greater public good. The same is true with the area of obscenity.
One's freedom, one's rights extend only as far as the boundary of another person's rights or freedom. And so if in some way one's freedom and rights are impinging on the normal growth and development of a child or the well-being of some other human being, psychological or whatever, I think that should be taken into consideration. An inherent kind of deterrent against this so-called freedom.
Our laws are there to try to protect the rights of little people to get their points across, too. They're not there necessarily to only establish the right of one group to have control over information delivery.
If we continue to do things in the name of freedom of speech that seem to abridge the rights of parents to protect their children and so on, where is that going to lead us? What's going to happen to the public if they're frustrated that their kids are exposed to so much pornographic speech, if you will, and pornographic imagery, if you want to call it speech?
The eventual outcome in that process is a hedonistic society. If we don't have the means to forestall or turn back the tide of this onslaught of pornographic material in all forms of media, then eventually we'll go down the same road as the Roman Empire and many other societies into open hedonism. Another comment, another dimension to the idea of applying the free speech issue to this question of obscenity is it distracts from the real consequence and impact of this obscene material. You see, we can spend time ad infinitum discussing the legal civic question of freedom of speech, but at the same time our young people are being denied a right to grow and develop in a decent moral environment. And so I think when this whole question of freedom of speech is applied to obscenity in particular, it significantly violates the well-being, the moral and spiritual and emotional development of our young people.
So we do have to consider the rights of the children and the health of society as a whole. We do have a thing called a social compact where we would extend concern for everyone's children that we would have for our own. And I noticed that Hugh Hefner and Bob Guccione have both said publicly on television that they would not allow their own daughters or would not want their own daughters to be photographed in the nude, and yet they will readily recruit other people's daughters and photograph them and use them as commercial sexual merchandise to be sold all around the world for masturbational purposes. And so in effect they're breaking the social contract there. They're saying, I'll do something to your daughter that I believe is harmful, something I won't do to my own daughter. And that's breaking you're an outcast and you're a social outcast, because the society does have to agree about what things will be included in the social compact and the general welfare. And it has to do with this kind of extended family feeling toward each other. Well, I'll have concern for your mother and grandmother and child and neighbor because we're all in this together. And when that's violated, and people say I have a right to violate that, it seems to be a kind of dangerous and self-destructive pattern.
We dare not and in any way indicate insensitivity to First Amendment issues, even though it is technically not an issue. The reason for that is the battle is for the minds and the opinions of the great center of American opinion. And that center doesn't know that. And that center will have to have that explained to them over and over again in a way in which it becomes most persuasive. So that even though the Supreme Court has spoken, the propaganda on the other side that we are infringing the pornographer's First Amendment rights will not only continue, but in my judgment will grow much stronger. And our quiet, our informed arguments have to be there to meet them day after day after the day in a way so that repetition will win the day.
I think what our founding fathers had in mind as they were counteracting a tremendous abuse of power from the crown, they wanted to participate in interstate commerce and they didn't want to have soldiers quartered in their homes without their permission, and they wanted to have a right to say how much their taxes would be. And as they were concerned about what they sensed to be an abuse of power, they began to speak out, and of course, as they say, they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to resist and overcome what they felt was a severe abuse of power. And it seems to me that, therefore, our constitutional rights of free speech are very much centered in a right of the people to address abuse of power. And when the pornography industry has become an $8 billion industry, literally flooding every neighborhood, affecting every child, affecting every family in the land, we sense there is an abuse of power. I think maybe the people even senses that the government, when the government is authorized and commissioned to enforce obscenity and decency laws and it doesn't do it, that there is also an abuse of power there that the people need to address. And it seems to me that free speech, the free speech rights, the First Amendment rights, the rights of assembly, the rights of picketing, the rights of boycotting, are very much rooted in our founding fathers' understanding of the fact that we needed a legal, peaceful, sanctioned means to address abuse of power. And it's a tremendous power, an $8 billion pornography industry.
Well, in summing up the first section, it seems we've always had constitutional obscenity and indecency laws, and it seems we've had a tradition in our society of speaking out against abuses of power, as is represented by a $9 billion pornography industry. If our founding fathers gave us our free speech rights for anything, it certainly was that we could speak out and protect ourselves against those who would try to undermine the welfare of our society, of our families and children. And so it's very important that we use our free speech rights to speak up in every community across the land about our concern over the harm there is to pornography, which is the next section. What harm is there to pornography? One of the areas that has been of increasing alarm to me is the fact that we're getting more reports of young children viewing pornography and then copying or modeling the material on their younger brothers and sisters. Children are copycats. I've got 5 of them. And it's a sad thing that about half of our junior high children and grammar school children have already seen 1 or more X-rated videotapes. It has a great impact on them, and they begin copying the material on younger brothers and sisters often. Well, let's turn to the panel now and see what they have to say.
I found that at Hefner's mansion, there were pornographic movies played that and I was particularly involved with a group sex act that was with those pornographic movies. I found that I became very depressed and suicidal by being involved in these activities, and I found that everywhere I looked, the other bunnies seemed to be the same. My roommate was suicidal, Bobby Arnstein, who had trafficked drugs for Hefner, and was captured by the FBI for this and investigated, ended up committing suicide with a drug overdose. Of course, we've read about Dorothy Stratton, who was murdered by her ex-husband and then sodomized afterwards. I found on a personal level what the findings scientifically seem to bear out, that pornography and that lifestyle is addicting and escalating. And for me, it went from premarital sex when I was 18 to sex with married men, to the group sex, and also where homosexuality was encouraged.
So you're indicating there was a kind of a progressive,
yes,
kind of humiliating, degrading involvement then, starting from a permissive attitude about pornography from your own home.
Right. My father had every issue of Playboy, and there was that philosophy that premarital sex won't hurt anybody, you know, nobody's forcing you to do it, it's okay, it feels good, do it. And that the Judeo-Christian ethic that I had also heard, having been churched when I was young, that was repressive, that there was something wrong with that, and if you could just become sexually free enough that it didn't bother you, that you could have sex with all these different people, that you would truly be liberated and could enjoy it.
But I found just the opposite to be true. I became more and more depressed and anxiety-ridden. It was no longer guilt directly associated with sex outside of marriage. It was just, it became a very horrible problem that I sought psychiatric counseling for like 7 years and was not remedied because I was living that lifestyle no matter what I did. And I talked with, on a woman-to-woman talk show, one of the centerfolds also was traumatized, and she sought psychotherapy for 4 years. I saw another centerfold talk about an attempted rape because she was a Playmate of the Year and someone recognized her car. And I think there's just a lot of seamy and dirty sides of it, not to mention the fact of the disease that's so rampant.
On a high school campus, I'm constantly running into kids that are running around with Playboy jackets or Playboy caps and that type of thing. Recently, I had a friend who told me that he was at one of the other high schools in my area in San Francisco, and he was talking to kids about careers and professions. And a lot of the kids in the background were being somewhat unruly, and they were talking about they didn't really need to get job training because they were involved in selling drugs, and a lot of those kids were involved in thinking that they were going to eventually be pimps. Those are the types of effects that we are seeing on the high school campuses almost daily, where kids are beginning to think in terms of each other as primarily pieces of meat.
Freud himself, believe it or not, I think would, if he were alive, would be up here with us fighting the same battle, despite all the mistaken notions popularly abroad about Freud and de-repression of sex and so on. Because if you read his material carefully, you'll see that he attributes many of the difficulties in later life to early childhood sexual experiences that could not be integrated by the child.
Certainly no one would dispute the fact that we have had a sexual revolution in this country. In fact, Hefner takes credit for having started it in 1950. And we're here now, some 30 years later, to examine what we've spawned in this sexual revolution. And what we are seeing, of course, is a very random, casual attitude on the part of our young people toward their sexual activity as early as 12 years old. In fact, even sometimes earlier than 12 years old. I've been involved in delivering the second baby to 14-year-old girls, and there's no question that we have an epidemic of teenage pregnancy and teenage sexual promiscuity. But that is not the ultimate harm of this sexual revolution and this perpetuation of recreational sexual attitudes through pornography and obscene material. The more devastating harm is the subsequent venereal epidemic that we now have, which we're evidencing from the medical standpoint, diseases such as herpes that there's no known treatment for, which is a very devastating clinical condition, which has rendered patients infertile. We're witnessing epidemic of venereal diseases very common to us, such as gonorrhea, that are unresponsive to agents such as penicillin. And so we're witnessing an epidemic of other sexually transmitted diseases such as chlamydia, which is just becoming more and more apparent to us as a very overwhelming and prevalent sexually transmitted disease. And then the offshoot from that, of course, is we're finding now there's more heterosexual transmission potential for AIDS.
There's no question that to any psychiatrist's mind, these early stimulating acts, whether they're in the flesh or on TV, whatever, do have a serious deforming effect on the developing psyche of the child.
We have to recognize that we won't get physical care for our child perhaps in the same way that that child deserves and we have paid for because of the enormous burden of increasing kinds of cases such as AIDS and other kinds of things that are related to the sexual promiscuity concept.
There was a time early in my training where we were able to identify the consort when a patient was identified with gonorrhea, for example. It was just a matter of contacting the sexual partner and treating him as well. But what we're finding now is because of such a casual attitude towards their sexuality, many times the young woman doesn't know who she contacted gonorrhea from, or she doesn't know which of the several young men that she's been involved with gave her the gonorrhea. So it's that kind of alteration of how we approach our sexual responsibility that has such severe medical consequences.
Aren't we really talking about a physiological activity, which is really a pornographic high, that is no different than the individual who takes heroin and gets a high? Aren't we talking about adrenaline and testosterone, and aren't we talking about building up tolerance levels internally, endogenously, in the same way that a person does when they take a drug?
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly good hypothesis, and I think we should somehow or other do some research on that.
A lot of people's minds are being altered by the pornography that they consumed, and it's actually not enhancing their ability to perform, but it's actually damaging it. In fact, Dr. Klein has found that one of the ironies of regular exposure to pornography is it desensitizes you, and one aspect of the desensitization is that you lose your ability to enjoy normal sex. You've got to go for more kinky and perverse and bizarre stuff. And so the very thing it purports to give us, it actually robs us of, which is similar to drugs.
Bumped into Dr. Klein on a couple of occasions in seminars, and he would talk about the clinical data he had from 225 individuals who had been heavily involved in pornography. And he said it starts out with addiction, analogous to heroin, morphine addiction. He said then there's the desensitization, or escalation was the second one. Rougher and more bizarre materials were required to get the same sexual kicks. Mm-hmm. Then there was the desensitization process in which those things which were formerly taboo lost that. And then there was the final aspect of it, which was imitation or acting out of the behavior seen in the magazines. Well, I had never put that four-part syndrome together, but in counseling with people in my office in the pastorate for years, I heard women come in and say, "You wouldn't believe what my husband's asking me to do." Bizarre things, which he didn't get out of a vacuum. He didn't pull out of the sky somewhere. He was into that fourth part of Klein's syndrome. And I think anybody who has done much counseling today understands that harm of pornography is very definitely with us, that people are acting out what they're seeing in that as they get progressively into the pornography.
If you can charge $150,000 for 30 seconds on television to influence people to buy something, to take certain action, and then for the next 18 minutes you celebrate promiscuous sex and expect that not to have an impact, it just doesn't fit, does it?
That's right.
Our research, we find consistent reference in Playboy particularly, but Penthouse and Hustler, constant depictions of men as impotent, constant depictions of men as too small, constant depictions of men as castrated. Men are consistently ridiculed in this material. So what you have in our material is consistent ridicule of masculinity on the one end, sexually. You have images of children as viable sexual objects. We had 14,962 images of crime and violence. All of this just in those 3 magazines. So in terms of harm, we know kids are imitating that. This is our major form of sex education for our youth. This material that we are talking about for 30 years has not been consumed by adults. It has been consumed by juveniles and adults, and those juveniles have grown into adults. We see it consistently in the data on serial rape murder. We know that this has been an initial activity for serial rape murderers. We know that it has remained a consistent activity, and on and on and on. Yeah, there's harm.
We've just heard an interesting segment on the harm there is to pornography, including comments by a former Playboy bunny who had firsthand involvement, comments by Dr. D'Agostino, a psychoanalyst, and researcher, Dr. Judith Reisman, people who've thought a lot about it and have firsthand experience. One of the interesting things is that pornography seems to be addictive, that regular exposure draws us into a compulsive attachment where we need to return again and again. And the second phase is escalation. We need to see more bizarre and kinky, perverse kinds of things to get the same excitement. The third phase then is desensitization. We become callous to many normal kinds of sexual behavior. I think it's interesting that one of the aspects of desensitization is the fact that it actually damages our ability to enjoy normal sex. In the same way a drug addict takes drugs because he thinks it'll expand his mind, it will in the long run damage his mind. It seems that pornography is the same way. It offers the prospect of more fulfilling sexual experience, and in the long run it seems to actually rob us of that. And then of course the fourth stage is actualization, where people begin acting out the things they've been feeding their minds on. It makes sense that if people become obsessed mentally, obsessed with certain images and behavior, that at some point that's going to affect their behavior. Let's move on to the next section now, which is how did we get the present flood of pornography? It was just 30 years ago that Hugh Hefner began producing his magazine Playboy. At that time, it was very difficult to find any kind of a pornographic magazine. Today, pornographic magazines are by far the leading selling publications on America's newsstands. How did we get to this place? Let's turn to the panel.
We hear the story all the time, well, pornography is nothing new, it's always been around, and we know that it was, but it was always part of an elite, small, isolated group that had access to it and used it, well-to-do people, the aristocratic, the Marquis de Sade, that sort of thing. I, of course, would argue that one of the breakthroughs was Kinsey in 1948 with his sexual behavior in the human male, in which he really materialistically objectified human interaction and just identified sex as an outlet. Period. Now, that becomes very interesting because then you have Hugh Hefner in 1953, December, in his first issue, identifying the fact that Kinsey was the most important man to him in terms of his development and his attitudes towards sex, and that his magazine would be a continuation of that. And I would give credit to Hefner. I would say that he's right, that he did a brilliant marketing job, that he found what we call the alpha males, the individuals who could spread his values to the rest of society. He targeted the young adult college male and targeted his values change into that direction, which was ready for it. And I think that through some brilliant kinds of marketing techniques and the right kind of groundwork, people were slipping away from religious belief as it was, and kind of a little bit shaky, that the whole thing then just mushroomed. And I do think it's a question of addiction, and I think it's a question of chemical response, and I think that it's internally addictive because it does indeed trigger chemical responses in the human being, which the human being has nothing to do with, can't control one with the other. So I think it was an inevitable escalation. Penthouse and Hustler and the rest of them stepped into what already had a monetary, incredibly high monetary value.
We've gotten to this point by merely being lazy. Oftentimes you see things that are going wrong in our society and you're afraid to get involved. You see a crime committed and you won't say anything because you're afraid to get involved. You don't want to take time off from work. You're afraid that if you say something that you will be reprimanded for saying something. And I, as a coach on a high school level and working with teachers, I oftentimes hear kids say things, I oftentimes see kids do things, and no one will say anything because they're afraid of getting involved. They're afraid of being called square. They're afraid to be different.
In 1966, we had the Fanny Hill case, Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure. And two of the justices added the added test that it must also be utterly without redeeming social value. Now, there is nothing that doesn't have some social value, and to make it plain, they said even a dash of social value is enough. So as a consequence, the prosecutors, the federal prosecutors, and the state prosecutors threw up their hands. They didn't prosecute. From 1957 to 73, very few prosecutions. Then we had the Miller case that said this utterly without redeeming social value is for the birds, and they threw it out the window. And they substituted that it must have serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Now, from 73 to 86, we've been trying to tell the prosecutors, you can go now, you can do it, go. And we're just now reaching that goal. So we had this tremendous period of time when there were no prosecutions, and the pornographers just filled up that void.
My grandfather used to say that figures don't lie, but liars figure. And I think that it's clear, as long as people make a lot of money and the bottom line figure's a big one, that you're going to see pornography in the marketplace illegally or illegally. It's almost that simple. As long as there's money to be made, there's somebody out there that's going to try it.
And then the preachers aren't preaching on it. We don't have the issue taught in this moral, arena where we exchange important ideas in the church. We haven't dealt with the issue, but I see that changing. And I think as the church gets educated and as the preachers begin preaching on it, that's going to make a major difference. I think that'll affect, there are a lot of prosecutors in those churches, for instance. Sure. In Oklahoma City, the local prosecutor started prosecuting. He's a member of the same church where the guy leading the anti-pornography fight was a member. And in that church arena, the prosecutor was fired up and coerced, perhaps, to begin prosecuting.
When I was growing up, it was cool to smoke cigarettes. And I got in trouble with my brothers for going around the back of the house and smoking a few cigarettes. Now today, it's uncool to smoke. It used to be cool to drink when you're going to your prom and to drive your car like a nut and kill people, and it's not cool anymore. And I think this great middle we're talking about, where we have to make sure that the data is correct and it's simply and properly given and disseminated to them. Once they realize that obscenity isn't cool and its impact on the American family isn't cool, and you're not avant-garde and jet-setty when you participate in this kind of thing, the American people, which as a body politic are really sound, reasonable folks who work hard every day, are going to say, no, it's not cool. And once it's not cool, it won't be profitable. And when it's not profitable, people aren't going to do it.
Well, we've just discussed Hugh Hefner's clever packaging and marketing of pornography. We've discussed major corporate sponsorship. We've discussed the apathy in our society today, the unwillingness of people to be called a little bit square. We seem to almost worship tolerance, that the bottom line virtue that any American should have is to be tolerant of everything. So we've not resisted many things which have been tremendously damaging to our society. Let's turn to the next section now. What can we properly and legally do to turn back the present flood of pornography?
I traveled around the country doing seminars on obscenity and pornography for the last 4 years, and it didn't really matter where I went. I heard people asking the same three questions. They would ask, number one, where has anybody done anything? Number two, how did they do it? And number three, how can we put that into practice here? And I bumped into people in the Justice Department, people in the FBI, and they said, well, they pointed to one place in the country where there had been long-standing success in the battle against obscenity and pornography, specifically hardcore pornography. It was Hamilton County, Ohio. Really, for a span of over a decade, they had had success. And currently, there are no adult bookstores in Hamilton County, Ohio, and that's a metropolitan area of I believe it's 1,200,000. All right, no adult bookstores, no adult cinemas, no topless, bottomless bars. There are no X-rated video cassettes sold or rented in Hamilton County, Ohio today. All right, now what happened there? I've been told by the people who are in the know on this thing that the two things pornographers fear are strong citizens' action and raw courtroom power. And when you get a combination of those two things, then you've got a combination which pornographers cannot combat. They have had that in Cincinnati, Ohio. You've been there and you've been a part of what they've been doing in Cincinnati, and you know that there has been a tremendous base for enforcement of obscenity laws. Now, there had to be that base, there had to be that citizens' participation, because a lot of times prosecutors went into court and lost, and they got some bad press as a result of that. But there was still a strong base of citizen support, and that base said, go back again, and go back again, and go back again, and they were encouraged to do this. I spoke at Lieutenant Mills' retirement. Lieutenant Harold Mills on the Vice Squad hounded the pornographers with a single-minded intensity for years. They knew him by name. And his position on the thing was, if it looks obscene, we're going to try to get it into court. If it looks obscene, we're going to try to allow the people to say whether it's obscene. And Art Ney, who is a county prosecutor currently, said, if it looks obscene, we're going to prosecute. We may lose some, but he said, to me, it's like a 15-round battle. It's like a boxing match. We may lose a round or two or three or four or five or six or seven, but he said, we believe we're ultimately going to win. And now over a period of the last decade, they kept going back to court and back to court and back to court and back to court on things that looked to be obscene. And what they discovered was that the pornographers decided that it was no longer profitable for them to operate in Hamilton County, Ohio. And now it has a reputation of being the worst county in the country for the marketing of X-rated video cassettes or X-rated material altogether. What they've decided, it's not profitable in Hamilton County, we move out somewhere else. And we can keep rolling them back like that if we'll just get enforcement of the laws which are already on the books.
So you're saying you have to have good citizen concern and organization, and you have to have strong courts.
That's right.
And they're related. That
they are related.
The courts also respond. The judges, prosecutors, police force respond to an aroused citizenry.
Sure, they can show you stacks of letters which they've gotten from citizens in Cincinnati, Ohio. The prosecutor and the police chief can show you stacks of letters where people said, we support the enforcement of vice laws. And they said that's important to us.
But there's hardly anything really that exists in that material that doesn't exist in its core in the material that we have right here. This last Playboy, the Mary Mortician. I mean, this is necrophilia.
Yeah.
And if we can, to me, if we can get people to deal with the stuff that's right in front of them, then then the rest of the stuff would fall into line. If we can get them to understand that when they buy this, they've just bought something on necrophilia, and that they're just being told that their deviant sexual behavior is appropriate to have sex with the dead, then I think that the rest of the stuff would tend to fall in line. Because if you don't accept this, you're certainly not going to accept what's in the back alley.
This is essentially a battle of words. It's essentially a battle of ideas. Not essentially, it is a battle of ideas. Why the flood of pornography? I have an answer for that. The answer is because pornography is profitable. It is profitable for some people, some human beings, to hurt and maim and denigrate other human beings for their own profit, and to yet still entertain third human beings. That is not a very pretty picture. All of us have to be very, very careful about what we do and what we say. This is a moment where precision of language is important. If the language is imprecise, the battle is going to be lost. For example, we are against obscenity. We are not against sexuality. That's a very important distinction. The answer lies in an effort to replace some of these materials with equally satisfying, intoxicating materials that are not pornographic.
Well, it's clear from the last section that there are things we can do, and we have a right and a responsibility to take measures that are legal and proper to try to control the flood of pornography, because there are people who will do almost anything to make money, and they'll do it in a big way if there's no restraint. We've had very little law enforcement in recent years, and it's just beginning to change now, and we need to continue public pressure, public awareness, public education, public action. It's interesting, there are some forms of pornography, as was pointed out, that are illegal, and there are laws against that kind of hardcore obscenity, and those laws need to be enforced. But there are other kinds of pornography that reach our children in an even greater scale that we can control with persuasion and boycotting, picketing, public pressure, letter writing. Maybe you've got a neighbor that is involved in distribution in family stores of some types of pornography. Well, you can influence him. So in any case, we need to speak out against all forms of pornography. It's our right and duty, responsibility if we want to have a decent moral environment for our children. Now, the National Decency Forum this year is recommending the LEAD program, LEAD. We picked those letters because it stands for the 4 areas of pornography enforcement and of the pornography problem that are easy to remember. LEAD, LEAD. First one is legislation. There are laws on the books and laws that need to be passed both federally and in a statewide basis to control pornography. We need better dial-a-porn, better cable porn legislation. We need to address the problem of satellite pornography. The FCC has had a traditional mandate in this area, and we need to encourage a clarification of its mandate. Then we have the second letter, E, for enforcement. We need to encourage our federal agencies, the Justice Department, the FBI, the Federal Communications Commission, the Customs Bureau, the Postal Bureau, to enforce laws on the books. Enforcement needs to happen in a widespread way on the local scene. And we need to get our local prosecutors moving, our state prosecutors moving. Enforcement will only happen if the public lets their feelings be known to local, state, and federal prosecutors. Then the third letter, A, for advertising. We've had tremendous success in recent years addressing advertisers, those who sponsor pornography with their ads, those who sponsor certain objectionable programming with their ads. They're the ones with the financial clout to make a big difference. And we've seen over 50% of Playboy's advertisers voluntarily remove their ads from Playboy in recent years, which has helped remove this patina of acceptability that Playboy magazine has represented. And so we need to continually, tactfully address the advertisers. Say, we're surprised that you're sponsoring this kind of material or advertising in this kind of a publication. And the fourth area, D, distribution, LEAD. Pornography is distributed in our society through many means. Through the Postal Service, there's over 100,000 mailing of obscenity violations a day in the U.S. Postal Service, and there's only been 2 or 3 convictions for the mailing of adult obscenity in the last 5 years. We have the Customs Bureau. Does a good job, but only is able to intercept a small percentage of the tremendous amounts of child pornography, adult obscenity that's shipped into this country from overseas. We have the distribution of pornography through family drugstores and convenience stores, although we've been successful in seeing over 25,000 family food stores and drugstores remove the pornographic magazines. They still are distributed massively through airport newsstands, community newsstands, newsstands on the streets. We have over 20,000 X-rated bookstores in the country, 4 times as many X-rated bookstores as we have McDonald's hamburger stands. They're distributed through over 40,000 neighborhood video stores now that have just cropped up in the last few years. Pornography is distributed via satellite porn now and cable porn. More and more cable pornography is reaching our children, and they're copying this stuff. It's very sad. So it's coming into our neighborhoods and coming into our communities in various means, various distribution vehicles that we each need to address. And we would encourage you to get the LEAD program materials so that you will get a better overview of the problem and will be able to give leadership in your community, friendly, persuasive, and well-informed leadership in your community so that we can make an impact, so that we can let our kids know that we care enough about this issue, that we stood in our time and made a difference, so that we just didn't become a totally hedonistic, materialistic, sensual society, but we maintained our respect for dignity, our respect for commitment and marriage, our respect for sexuality, to keep it at a high level, a dignified level, really to protect our ability to enjoy normal sex. And it's important that we get this material and this information and that you begin to apply it in your communities, and we want to help you do that. I want to thank the panelists for joining us today. They did an excellent job, and I want to thank each of you for participating today. Thank you very much.
You've heard from our group of experts. that America has a problem. Her decency standards have nearly disappeared. These men and women are not against healthy sexuality. They are against the commercialization and perversion of sex, and they are calling for a new wave of healthy imagery in our land. We've spent 25 years celebrating aberrant sexual behavior. The result? Epidemics of teenage sexual activity, promiscuity, and pregnancy, and an epidemic of venereal disease that is even worse. The presence of pornography in the nation's homes leads girls like Brenda McKillop to think it is perfectly acceptable to enter Hugh Hefner's dark world of recreational sex and drugs. Pornographic magazines and films have had a tremendous impact on our society. They are the major form of sex education for our juveniles. You've heard Dr. Reisman say even the most accepted soft porn magazines contain images of children as adult sex objects. Tony Bishop told us our high school campuses have become so permissive, kids think of each other as pieces of meat. Pornography, like drugs, is both addictive and escalating, and leads its users in progressively humiliating and degrading involvement. The consumption of pornography alters people's minds and robs them of the ability to enjoy normal sex. Is it a First Amendment issue? Obscenity, that is hardcore pornography, is not protected speech. It is in fact unlawful. The commercial distribution of it is a crime. Strong citizen action coupled with law enforcement can rid communities of it. Softcore pornography or indecent material is not so clear-cut. Besides generally weakening standards, it is used by molesters to lower the inhibitions of children and by rapists to prepare for seeking out a victim. There are inherent limitations on any freedom when it infringes on the rights of others. Instead of being intimidated by free speech advocates, we must use our freedom of speech to come against abuse of power, to call for responsibility and standards. It's up to every family in America to say enough. In America, we get what we ask for. If we, the people, stopped looking at pornography, stopped buying it, pointed to its many harms, and demanded that our laws and decency standards be enforced, we could overcome this problem. Our government agencies need to hear from an outraged people that they aren't doing their job. They aren't protecting us from this harmful material. If they had, things would never have become so bad. Won't you call in to that talk show? Support your local decency leader. Write a letter to the editor. Tell that advertiser you won't use his product until he stops promoting pornography. And encourage your local prosecutor to enforce the law. If we all speak up together, we can help people realize that pornography, like smoking, isn't cool anymore. It is harmful, and our country would be better off without it.